Hey everybody, welcome to the I Am Podcast YouTube channel.
Make sure to tap the bell, subscribe, and comment down below.
Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of the I Am Podcast.
Welcome back. Today we have an incredibly special guest. Ginanne, will you please introduce yourself?
My name is Ginanne Brownell, and I am a journalist based in London, but originally from Michigan.
And like London, UK.
As in London, yes, in London, UK. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'll try not to throw it, not London, Ontario, which is I've been to and I grew up near, but no, London, UK. I will try to not use many British expressions because every once in a while I'll sort of, say something like, "Oh, it's cold. I need to put my jumper on." And my American friends are like, "Stop, just stop." Like you're just being pretentious. And I'm like, "No, I've just lived here for a long time and I forget to not use British expressions." So.
How long have you lived there now?
I've been in the UK now for 27 years, which is crazy. It's been a really long time. I moved here for graduate school and just kind of never left. And yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm, a very transatlantic person. I have like one foot in, the UK and one foot in sort of the US. And so it's sort of a weird sort of space to be in. But I'm kind of used to it at this point. So.
I love that. It's funny to me that you haven't, like Canadian, well, did you grow up in Canada?
I didn't grow up in Canada. I always say that I'm kind of like partially Canadian because I grew up in Michigan. And so obviously we are bordered on both sides by Canada. And so when I was a kid, we used to be able to use Canadian quarters as legal currency in Michigan. So like I remember one time when I was maybe like 10 going to Chicago and trying to buy chocolates and I had like all this spare change and I like was paying like part of it in like Canadian quarters. And the person was like, "What is this?" And I was like, "It's a quarter." And he's like, "It's Canadian." I was like, "Yeah." But I just literally didn't realize that you couldn't use Canadian because in Michigan, I don't know if you still can, but definitely when I was growing up, you could use it. So I'm, pretend Canadian. We got the CBC on our cable channel. And yeah, we used to, go drinking in Windsor. I shouldn't say that, but yeah, we used to go drinking in Windsor when I was in university. And yeah, because it was the drinking age was 19 in Canada and 21 in the US. So yeah.
On your dollar, the dollar's worth more, so then you could drink for like cheaper.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes.
So,
So tell us your story. Tell us
yeah.
like what got you to where you are today and your ties to why you're here, I
Yeah,
guess.
your ties to fertility.
Yeah, your ties to fertility.
My ties to fertility. Okay. Well, so as I mentioned, I'm a journalist, and I have unexplained infertility. And so when I can sort of give you that whole story as well. But I was my children were born through surrogacy in 2018 in Illinois, and sort of when I 2 years after they were born, right when COVID started, I was trying to think of like a project to work on, and I sort of thought, well, maybe I should write about sort of the surrogacy journey that I was on. But then I thought, I just don't want to write a memoir because who really cares to hear just my story? But I thought, how can I use my sort of journalistic, my sort of, my wheelhouse, as it were. And so I decided to write a book looking at surrogacy across the globe, looking at everything from, feminist arguments for and against surrogacy, looking at, who becomes a surrogate, how children born through surrogacy feel about it, what are the sort of debates around surrogacy globally. And so that's kind of what the book is about, which just came out last month. It's called Elusive Mommyhood, an investigative reporter's personal journey into IVF and surrogacy. But that kind of came on the heels of a very long fertility sort of, I don't want to say drama. Well, it was a drama actually, but I tried all sorts of assisted reproduction, IVF, fresh transfers, frozen transfers, and I was just told after about 3 years of trying that I had unexplained infertility. And so, because we were already sort of down the assisted reproduction route, my well, he was my husband at the time, now my ex-husband, we decided to try to do surrogacy because we still had some genetic material and whatever. So anyway, so we had another 2 years of like a long drama with our surrogacy until my kids were born in 2018. So there's a very long answer to your question.
Did you have twins via surrogacy or did you have two surrogates?
I have twins via surrogacy. I have a boy and a girl who are 7, who I just found out. I just checked my email and my son got in trouble today. I have a boy and girl, and my son just got in trouble for playing like something on the iPad he wasn't supposed to at school. So after we finish this call, I'm going to give him a call because he's at his dad's and we're going to have a really one of those conversations. But yes, I am now a mom of very feisty but wonderful twins.
That's
I
awesome.
love that.
Were you and your surrogate able to be close through your journey? How did that kind of go?
Well, funny enough, we just saw our surrogate for the first time in 7 years since the twins were born last weekend. She was in London visiting her daughters in Spain on an exchange program, and so we met up and we had lunch, and it was just really fun for the kids to kind of, meet her and me to see her again. But yeah, so when we started the surrogacy journey. We had at the time it was Skype. Now nobody uses Skype. We all use Zoom. But we had a Zoom conversation with Julie and her husband Chad, and they had 5 kids between them. And we were sort of talking about why did she want to become a surrogate. And so we just kind of had like a 2-hour conversation before we sort of decided to work together. And then we worked, it was like a year and a half, 2 year long process between trying, getting all the paperwork signed. She had one miscarriage. She also had another attempt that never led to a pregnancy. So it was a long, drawn out process. And so, but one of the things that I really was, compelled about with Julie, or that, kind of was important to me about Julie, was that she has a really strong sense of self, and a very strong agency. And so, I always knew that, I trusted her implicitly in terms of, to make the right decisions on things, which I was really right to, because at one point she, as I mentioned, had a miscarriage, and she sort of had the proactiveness to understand what was happening to take care. So I just there were, we I wouldn't say that we're like really close friends, but we definitely have this bond, this relationship that is unique to an intended mother and a surrogate that you have. And I think, and I very much let her lead on that. I was kind of like, what kind of relationship do you want to have? And she was like, I don't need a best friend. And I was like, awesome. I don't either. Like, it was just a very open conversation from the start. And it's continued to be that. And it was just really special, seeing her this weekend after not seeing her since the kids were born. So that was really kind of a fun side note.
That's really, really cool. So she lives, you said in Illinois?
Well, she just moved to Florida, actually. So she was living in Illinois, which actually is one of the best states in the US, for surrogacy. They have a very, very good laws in place. I didn't know that when we were sort of starting our surrogacy journey, because every state in the US has different laws, because surrogacy falls under both family law and contract law, which are sort of legislated on the state versus the federal level. So every state's very different. So luckily, Illinois was a great state to do our surrogacy in. But now she's in Florida, which I don't think is such a great state. But anyway, that's where she is now. So
What's one piece of advice you would give to someone starting this journey with a surrogate? Like, what would be, now from your perspective, where you are today, what's one thing you wish you knew going into this?
well, that's actually one of the reasons I wrote my book, is because I sort of felt I didn't know a lot going into it. And I didn't feel that there was so much information, and yet like it was so much that I just couldn't even get my head around it. And so I think that one piece of advice that I would give people is, if you happen to know people who've gone through surrogacy before, to try and talk to them. I was really lucky because I had some friends, a gay Israeli couple, who were sort of about 13 months ahead of me in terms of their surrogacy journey. And so when we found out that we had to do surrogacy, or that we were going to do surrogacy because I couldn't carry pregnancy, I reached out to them. And so I would say, if you know people that have done it before, reach out to them. If you don't know people who've done it before, there are lots of organizations out there that can, either put you in touch with surrogates, or there's, just more information to sort of understand a bit about sort of how it all works. And I think when I talk about surrogacy, I find it really important to define where we're talking about it, right? Because surrogacy is so different, not only from state to state in the US, but across the globe. I mean, surrogacy laws in Canada, the provinces are all different, right? I mean, surrogacy law in,
Yes and no.
Yes and
yeah,
no. We see the differences in surrogacy law is actually in the after, like the paperwork that is needed in terms of, like, depending on where
Taking
intended
their baby home.
taking your baby home. Province to province is a little different on kind of what they need and what they're looking for. And then of course, I mean, as you know, like it might the paperwork needed might be different depending on where your intended parents are from. You know, where are you taking this baby back to? What
Uh-huh.
paperwork do you need to go there?
And that like that's where the agency
The
is so
agency and the lawyer,
important.
the agency and the lawyers to understand and to work through what needs to happen. But yeah, you're right. It's so different. The concept is the same, but the
Yeah.
way we treat it globally is so different.
And I always use this example that I sort of say, you would never compare, for example, educational outcomes in, France and Finland, comparing that to educational outcomes in like Niger and Afghanistan, right? Like, why would you ever compare things that are so different? And it's the same with surrogacy. Like, why would you compare surrogacy in places like the UK or Israel or the US, where you have laws in place, to places in the developing world like, Laos, Cambodia, Ghana, so oftentimes, I think people who are in the anti-surrogacy space like to conflate that, and they like to confuse it, and they like to say, well, look what happened in this country. Obviously it's going to happen here. And it's like, no, that's not going to be the case. And so I think that sort of oftentimes is a trick that they do, to kind of, people who are against surrogacy, to kind of try to compare and contrast things that really aren't, it's not apples to apples.
Yeah. What's one thing that you found most surprising when researching for your book? Like what
Well,
box off?
yeah,
I
well, what not, go ahead, sorry.
I ordered your book,
Yes.
but it's not here.
That's okay. That's fine. Thank you for ordering it. I think the thing that knocked my socks off the most is that now I'm going to get like really history nerdy here, but bear with me.
Okay.
So as I mentioned, I'm from Michigan originally, and one of the things that I was really taken aback by was when we were looking to do surrogacy, I wanted to work with a surrogate in Michigan because at the time my mother was still living in Michigan, and I knew it was going to be a lot of logistical stuff after the kids were born to kind of, deal with things like getting their passports and social security numbers and whatever. Anyway, our agency in Boston, when I asked about doing surrogacy in Michigan, they're like, nope, you can't. It's the only state that has that surrogacy is a felony, because compensated surrogacy and contracts were a felony in Michigan from 1988. And I was like, well, that's weird. Anyway, long story short, I kind of skipped through that. In our surrogate's contract, it said she couldn't go to the state of Michigan while she was pregnant, in the second and third trimester. Again, didn't really think much about it because our goal at that point was let's, get these babies, right? And then when I started working on this book, I started looking into it, and turns out Michigan has a very important role in the global history of surrogacy. And I'll tell you why that is. First of all, it's the first place in the world where a compensated surrogacy contract was signed, and that was in 1976. And it was also the first place in the world where the first child born through gestational surrogacy was born in 1986 in a place called Ypsilanti in Michigan. And it's also the first place in the world where a judge ruled that the intended parents and not the surrogate of this gestational surrogacy should go on the birth certificate. So that was all, and it was the reason why. It was because there was a lawyer by the name of Noel Keene, and he was based in the Detroit area. And Noel Keene was sort of creating, in 1976, he signed this first contract, and then he realized, hey, there's a business opportunity here. And he's a very sort of, I don't want to say nefarious character, that's not correct, but he's a very controversial figure in the surrogacy world. Anyway, and so in 1985, sorry, I'm almost done with my nerdy lesson. In 1985, there was a case in the US called the Baby M case. And this was a case in New Jersey where a traditional surrogate, so obviously a surrogate who was also the egg donor, when she gave birth, she ended up taking the child and fleeing to Florida with the child. And it was a huge case, went all the way to the New Jersey Supreme Court, et cetera. And it was very big news nationally. And so the state of Michigan freaked out because they're like, wait, he's based here. He's doing all these surrogacy contracts here. We got to stop him. And so they created this law in 1988 called the Surrogate Parenting Act. And that put an end to surrogacy in Michigan. Well, it did, but there was a loophole. You could still do uncompensated, but I can bore you with that if you want to know more about that. But so that, in a very long answer, is what was really interesting for me, is being a person from Michigan and finding out what an integral role my state played in the history of surrogacy globally.
That's
That's
So
so
very
interesting.
super interesting. And I actually was really lucky because I was able to track down, not only the doctor who was the first doctor to implant, an embryo into the gestational surrogate, but also the woman who was born through it. She's now, let's see, she's going to be, I guess, 40 next year. Her name is Jill Rudnitsky Brand, and I got a chance to interview her, the first interview she's ever done on surrogacy, and talking to her about what it was like being that first gestational surrogacy, child born through gestational surrogacy surrogacy. And, so it was kind of really fun for me to kind of track her down and get a chance to get her thoughts on it. So yeah, that's kind of the background of that.
As a mom of children, born via surrogacy, and talking to her as, a grown adult, what was your biggest takeaway from all of that?
Well, it was really interesting because turns out she ended up having to use IVF, I think, to have her second child. And so we really kind of bonded on that. But she talked a lot about sort of, how people don't understand surrogacy, about how people have these sort of misconceptions about what it is and how that's very frustrating. She talked about sort of what it was like being like a first and knowing that she was a first and sort of realizing that it was kind of her story, but also her parents' story. And it's just really interesting talking to her about sort of, growing up knowing that you were sort of the first at something and what that meant. And like, she had like a couple really funny anecdotes that I put in the book about that, sort of thinking, like, is something going to happen to me because I'm the first and they don't know, they've never tested this out before. And, and she actually, we're still in touch. And unfortunately, her father, who was a cardiologist, and it was his idea in the first place to, sort of even look into gestational surrogacy, and reached out to the doctor in Cleveland who did this gestational surrogacy. He unfortunately passed away in December, but I would have loved to have chatted with him more about it. But so I tell the whole story of sort of her birth and all of that in the book as well.
That's so
That's
cool.
amazing, yeah. So y- your children, have they always known that they were born via surrogacy?
From the moment they were born. Yep, I've been really open. I mean, I knew sort of just instinctively to sort of be very open with them. But again, working on the book, I spoke to a lot of sociologists and psychologists and people, in the surrogacy space, and everybody said, the more open you are about it from the beginning, the more that it's just normalized. And my kids, I have a funny anecdote that I tell that because so my kids were born not only through surrogacy but also through egg donation, and so they know about that as well. And so one day we're in the car with my daughter and her best friend. They were going to gymnastics, and they were talking about how they pretend at school that they were born in the same hospital on the same day and whatever. And then her friend says, but she's, I've been told that, she didn't come out of, she wasn't born out of your body, or like somebody else gave birth to her. Like, she didn't, she wasn't, you didn't give birth to her. Is that true? And I was like, yeah, that's true. She was born through something called surrogacy and whatever. And I was waiting for this big follow-up question, to be like, oh my God. And the next thing her friend says to me, she's like, so do you like puppies or kittens better? And I was like, oh, okay. Like it was just really sweet because it's like it was obviously a topic of conversation that they'd had before. And it was just sort of something that like was sort of an interesting little thing. And then they moved on. And I think the earlier you tell your kids these things, again, it's more normalized, and they just sort of, that's their sort of story, right? Like it's nothing, nothing to sort of, be nervous about or concerned about or whatever. It's just like, it's the same thing as having like blue eyes or loving tennis over football.
Yeah, yeah, I love that.
I think it's really something that we've done well as a society as this has become more normalized and we do more of it. It's less shameful. It's less, because for a long time, if you were gay, there was no other way. Like the math didn't math if you have children, whereas with a hetero couple, there's more room for that secrecy and that, and I think it comes from a place of shame. I think it always comes most of the time. I think it comes from a place of shame if you're, a mom who can't carry your own babies, and the guilt and how that feels, and the embarrassment. And I think it's something that we're really doing a good job on as this continues and develops, and we get more information, and the babies born this way are older and can talk more and can share more of their stories, and like I think it's such a good thing for what we're doing, and the goals for the children that are born a product of this.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's an interesting point. I think two things I was going to mention. One of which was, I think that, again, I talk about this in the book, but I think that for gay men who do surrogacy, they come from a place of excitement, right? They come from a place of like, oh my God, we're going to have a baby. This is so awesome. And they can't wait to meet their surrogate. And it's just like this really positive experience. Whereas most women or heterosexual couples that come to surrogacy, either through infertility or because there have been health issues or whatever, it's a place of almost last resort, right? And so it's kind of like you come to surrogacy in this sort of space where you're just like, okay, this is like our last hope. And so I think that that sort of, is something. I think the other thing that you touched on, which is really important, and this is what I've been really trying to kind of express in sort of all the sort of interviews and people that I've been talking to around the launch of my book is we need to change the narrative around surrogacy because the problem is that for the longest time it has been, as you said, this sort of particular way of how it's presented, sort of like either the feminist arguments against surrogacy or, how are the children going to feel about it? And you know what? The only longitudinal study in the world that was ever done on children born through surrogacy was done at the University of Cambridge. It was a 20-year study. And in 2023, they released their results of this study. And you know what it proved and what they said and what it was across the board? That the kids didn't care. The kids were like, either like, hey, I was born through surrogacy, like this is a quirky little thing that I can tell people as an icebreaker, or who cares why I was born? Like, don't you want to talk about like how good my forehand is? Or don't you want to know about like, the robot project that I'm doing at school? They just, it to them, just was not important. And so this study, and this is the problem, is that a lot of, again, people who are against surrogacy either don't know about this study or they sort of bury it. And it's the only one in the world, the only one that's been done. And it was over 40 children born through surrogacy over a 20-year period. And I think that that to me is really elemental. And, we've got, I would say, a guesstimation of probably at least 100,000, well, hundreds of thousands of children born through surrogacy over the years. And the majority of those children are still minors, right? Because, it was very small amounts of people doing surrogacy at the beginning, and then it's gotten, more and more popular. And so those kids right now aren't able to communicate that, but they're starting to come of age. And boy, do they have opinions about this? And I think we need to change the narrative and start asking them how they feel about it, because at the end of the day, that's really what matters. How do they feel about it? And most of them sort of say, who cares? Why are we talking about it?
Yeah.
We
I
have,
think it's so funny because the piece that you started with between, a same-sex gay couple coming to this really excited and a hetero couple, I literally have that conversation 4 times a week at least, when I talk through, because part of what I do in my role is talking to potential surrogates and, the emotions and the connections and, how people come to surrogacy and, why they need your help. And like really literally, it's so funny to me because yeah, I use those phrases almost daily. Like that a same-sex gay couple know that they can't do this without this help. And, whereas this is the last resort for a hetero couple, no hopeful mom is like, I don't want to do this, or I really would rather someone else do this for me. Like it's something it's instinctual, for most people. I wouldn't want to like blanket statement that,
Mhm.
but for most people that desire is instinctual and it is like there's just no other solution for it than to have a baby. And if you need a surrogate, you are like at the end of the rope. And I mean,
Mhm.
most of the statistics, at least here in Canada, on that is that, most hetero couples have been at this 8 to 10 years to get, and that's just to get to the point of meeting a surrogate. That's
Mhm.
not, you
then you
know,
have another 2 to 3 year journey after that.
And I think that's also true about egg donation as well, right? Because again, if you're a gay couple, obviously, you got to get the eggs from somewhere. They're not your eggs. But there's a shame involved with women who feel like, oh, I don't want to tell anybody, that my kids are donor conceived. And so again, when I was working on this book and talking to people and getting lots of, sorry, my ex-husband's trying to call me. Anyway, I think it's because my son's in trouble. Anyway, so and I think that there's a shame that's there. And so again, one of the things that I think is really important is to really be open with your kids about it. And also the more people that can talk about it and be like, yeah, you know what? They are born through egg donation, and that's totally cool and that's okay. Because gay men will say to you, well, they'll say, why are you women, guy, why are you so ashamed of this? Why is this something you don't talk about? Like we obviously had to get an egg, it's an interesting disconnect in a sense that women feel like they just can't talk about it where, and it's I think the more, and same with sperm donation as well. But I think especially with egg donation, there's that kind of, and I actually there's a mom at school that I recently talked to about it. And she kind of, was confessed to me that, her child, and I was like, there's no confession there. Like your son's your son. It doesn't matter. So, yeah.
I also think we've talked about this over time, kind of like amongst ourselves and just when you like look and follow society, you know, not only has infertility rates gone up, but I think people tend to forget that there is a whole generation, there's multiple generations, honestly, of children who were adopted quietly. And that doesn't happen at the same capacity anymore. And I think part of what we do now and why surrogacy has taken off so much is because there isn't, we're more open about teen pregnancies and more pro-abortion. So these babies aren't, they're not being born in the first place. And I think it's really interesting because there's a lot of people that would be, adopted to a couple who just could never get pregnant. And now we don't see that so much. It's more of a you have to solve this problem yourself, or, the wait to get a baby is so long, or, whatever. And now you have the option potentially to have some genetic connection. And I think that's a really interesting, like, it's something that people I don't think also think through is, especially for what we do when everyone's like, well, just adopt. It's not the same
Mhm.
as adopting a baby as it in the 50s and 60s and 70s,
No, it's
you
so
didn't
hard to adopt a baby.
you didn't now you don't send your 15-year-old daughter who's pregnant away for 9 months and she comes back. Like it's not something we do anymore. And so it's a
Mhm.
really interesting, I think, angle in getting us to where we got to today, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really annoys me and a lot of people who, have their children through surrogacy is people will say, "Well, why didn't you just adopt?" Or like when we were going through the process, people saying, "Why didn't you?" And it's like they are two different things, right? Like, when you're so far into when you're down the assisted reproduction line, right? And you're really far down that, then you're what gonna like, all of a sudden like, put your brakes on and like circle back and go through the adoption process. I mean, first of all, some people just it's not something that they necessarily feel comfortable with, or it's not something that they necessarily think that they would be able to do to be a parent of children through adoption. And I think they're very special people that, that do that. But also, there are a lot of things that, disqualify people. For example, in some countries, if you and your partner, if your age equals like 80 or 85, so meaning like a partner, the husband and wife are both 40 or whatever, you can't adopt. So oftentimes women they don't know that they aren't able to have children until sort of later in their sort of fertility times. And so all of a sudden, like you kind of get like punished because you're older in terms of not being able to adopt as well. So I think it's a conversation that I have a lot, where I just sort of go like, this is not, this is not the only answer adoption, and I think that we need to again change the narrative around that and tell people, that's not the only way that you can expand your family. And it shouldn't be like, we always hear these sort of stereotypes of things that people say to, everybody who's going through sort of infertility struggles. And that's definitely one that drives a lot of us in this space nuts.
Understand how actually genuinely difficult it is to adopt. It's even
Yes.
your name on a list to adopt. Like
Yeah.
most people, it's not possible.
It's not possible. And I spent time in sort of the early 2000s. I spent a month volunteering in a state care home in Russia and working with children who were not necessarily orphans, as it were, but they were under the care of the state, who were up for adoption. And they were older children. But like I knew at that time that even though it was a really amazing experience to work with them, I just sort of thought like it's so tough to adopt, especially older children. And so, I think that again, it takes a special person and, they're amazing people that, do adopt, but it's not the only answer for people who have infertility. And I think that that's a conversation that needs to be nipped in the bud, about, oh, you can't have kids, adopt.
Yeah. It's not that easy. We actually, within ourselves, it's a statistic that we love, and I'd be interested if you have something comparable because we basically worked backwards, intended parents become parents, they have their baby. And it's about 80 people that have surrounded that family with love between the professionals, like to make this baby happen. So
The
your
agency, the
agency,
lawyers.
the lawyers, your surrogate, your team at the clinic, all of those pieces by the time you add those up. And I think that's just so special. Like these babies are so wanted and so, so loved. And it is special and it is different. And, for the people that can, get pregnant after a night out at the bar or, like you have a one night stand and get pregnant, like that's really cool. And those humans are loved and valued too. But there is a certain, I think, level of magic when you have this so much intention, I guess, and so many like people who are in this to help you with it. And that's not something
Yeah.
you get everywhere. Or, depending on your story, it's not something that the support you get, I guess.
No, I agree. I think it is really special. And I have a quote in the book from an Israeli guy who he and his husband had three children through surrogacy. They work with the same surrogate who's become very much a part of their family now. But, he brought her to Israel to sort of speak at an art exhibition. He's an artist. And I don't have the direct quote right now. It's in my book. But, he was talking to women afterwards and sort of saying, surrogates aren't there to take anything away from you. They're there to help bring you out. And, they're there to sort of like, bring something out of you. And I mean, there's a really amazing Israeli researcher who did a book about surrogacy in Israel. And she talks about this concept, and I love it, called birthing the mother. And that sort of surrogates, not only do they give birth to your children, but they also birth women as mothers. And I sort of say that at the end of my book, that Julie not only gave birth to my children, but she also gave birth to me as a mom. And that's like a really special thing. And I think that it must be, I never ask her that, just because I feel like she's not one of those people that's like somebody that you could kind of like have that moment with necessarily. But I do definitely feel that. And I think it is true that that must be a very special thing to not only know that you helped, you know, birth these wonderful children for another couple, but also that you gave birth to, a woman as a mom. And that must be really amazing.
The ripple effect of that. She made a mother, she made a father, she made grandparents, she made aunts and uncles, she made cousins. And that's felt for generations because,
Yeah.
hopefully, if that's what those kids want, they're going to go on to be a parent. They're going to go on to be a grandparent. They're going to have nieces and nephews and like
You make
all
a
stemming
whole life.
from one thing. I mean,
My favorite story is Christina, one of our team members, is a surrogate as well. And her intended mom, when her baby was born, she was a very quiet, kind of serious person. And she literally ripped her own shirt off when the baby
Mhm.
was born to be skin to skin, like just just turned wild. Do you know what I mean? Like she was born a mother right then.
hmm Yeah, I mean it's an amazing. I mean, you hear a lot of these stories of just it's just, and I think it's interesting because when I was working on my book, I interviewed a number of surrogates in the UK, the US, and in Israel. And what was really interesting to me was that I think people who are surrogates tend to be like not a specific kind of person. I want to stereotype them, but they're sort of people who kind of think outside the box, right? They're kind of people who, are quite interesting and unique people who kind of aren't sort of confined by sort of, conventional. I mean, they just are they have this, at least the ones that I spoke to, such an interesting outlook on life. They're just kind of like, I'm doing this for someone else, and they're very they beat to the rhythm of their own drum. Is that right, what I'm saying? But they're just, and it's very interesting. I mean, and so there have been a lot of sociologists who've done research on women who are surrogates in the US. And one of the things, again, kicking on these stereotypes, is that, for a long time, these second wave feminists would talk about, oh, it's surrogacy is so bad because, you're going to be taking advantage of Black and brown poor women, and you're going to kind of, have them, they're going to be surrogates for these really rich women who are going to take advantage of them. And actually, research has shown in the US that surrogates tend to be white, middle class women with, a certain level of higher education. They have jobs like they're teachers, they're doulas, they're ambulance dispatchers. They own businesses. Our surrogate has an MBA and runs a nonprofit housing charity. So I think that there are these stereotypes that we think about surrogacy or surrogates, at least when we're talking about the US, and I'm assuming it's probably very similar in Canada. It's definitely very much the case in the UK, where it's just not who they are, right? And I think that that's important. But we don't hear the voices of surrogates a lot, and that's really important too.
I do think that there is differences, the the cultural difference between a Canadian and American surrogate are a bit different. And we do see that because it's an altruistic system here in Canada. It's not, you're not paid. You're reimbursed for your things and your time and whatever. So it does unfortunately turn some people off. It does turn some people off because it's not, you're not getting paid. You're a
There's no
volunteer.
compensation.
You're a volunteer,
Yeah.
and that does change a bit. And that's part of the reason why people want to come to Canada because they don't want, they
Mhm.
want someone who is doing this
just wants to do
altruistically,
this.
I guess, if that makes
Well,
sense.
that's interesting that you said that. We like to use the term non-compensated because if you look at the dictionary definition of altruism and then you look at what the antonym is of it, it says selfish. And so anybody, whether you're compensated or not compensated, being a surrogate, there's an altruistic part to it. But we don't like to say altruistic when we're talking about non-compensated surrogacies because that implies that people who are compensated aren't altruistic. And that's not the case. But I see what you're saying. I mean,
Well,
that's a
and it's
good
a language
yeah.
difference too, right? Because here in the system, we would get in trouble. We would get criminally charged for paying a surrogate, right? It's really,
Mhm.
really important that we have to follow those things because people do get in trouble in Canada for paying their surrogate, and you can get
Mhm.
charged, and it's a really hard line we have to walk because unfortunately it makes things in there's good pieces to it, but there's pieces that make it harder for everyone too, right?
Mhm.
And so it is a very in the US because it is state to state, it's a little different, that
Mhm.
you have these different, whereas Canada is more blanket on those kinds of things
Mhm.
and what the language and what you how you set these ladies up who want to help someone and what they can get and what they can't, and those kinds of things. It is a different demographic that we would say is the Canadian ladies that are helping are a little bit different demographic.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. I mean, I think like, the whole compensation aspect is very interesting because part of, I mean, the last chapter in my book, I discussed this, but we changed the law in Michigan so that now in 10 days' time, Michigan will now allow for contract surrogacy and compensated surrogacy. It's no longer a felony. But one of the reasons why we argued for compensation in Michigan was our feeling was that everybody else in the process in the US gets, compensated, right? The doctors, the lawyers, the judges, the nurses, the sociologists, the agencies, the embryologists. And so the person that's actually doing all the heavy lifting, it's kind of not fair if she's not getting compensated. That's our view. I mean, obviously it's different, state by state, country by country. So it's interesting to hear, sort of in Canada what that's like. But that was one of the things that we were really keen on in our the law that we created in Michigan was allowing compensation if they wanted to have a compensated surrogacy.
That's really, really incredible that you were part of that.
Yeah, we worked on the bill. It's called the Michigan Family Protection Act, and it was a bill that we worked on for almost 4 years. What happened was when I was, researching my book, I came across a woman in Michigan who, like me, was really surprised about why it was still a felony in Michigan. And so it turns out we're from the same hometown, and we just really bonded. And she'd started this organization called the Michigan Fertility Alliance, and we just started talking, even sort of separately from me working on the book. And over time, she finally said to me, hey, do you want to kind of like help me on this? And so we spent 4 years, advocating to change the laws in Michigan. And so we last year, like I said, our bill was signed into law on April 1st, 2024. But because of weird quirks in how Michigan legislature works, it's now not going to be activated until April 1st of this year. But we're really excited because it's not just a surrogacy law. It's also a parentage law so that children who are born, if they're parents, same-sex couples, the parents don't have to go through, the second parent doesn't have to go through a second parent adoption, which can take a long time. And so every child now born in the state of Michigan through assisted reproduction will know when they leave the hospital who their parents are. It'll be very clear. So that's part of our bill was a surrogacy bill, but also a parentage bill. So I think that was kind of the thing that it was a great way to conclude my book. I didn't imagine my book was going to end this way because I never thought I'd say I changed the law. But yeah, that was sort of the end note on the book.
That's really beautiful.
That is really cool.
I have I want to go back. Maria and I are both egg donors. So how did you find your egg donor?
Well, I worked with our agency because what happened was our surrogate had a miscarriage of our last genetic embryo, and so we knew we had to work with an egg donor, which was really hard for me, to come to kind of terms with. But we sort of we went through a whole process where we found one egg donor who, on paper looked, amazing, and she was great. I did open donation. I don't want to tell people what they should and shouldn't do, but for me personally, I wanted to have an open donation, so we met with her, and unfortunately, when they tested the embryos, it turns out that there were genetic problems, genetic anomalies. So we had to work with a different egg donor. And so again, it was just somebody who our agency had on their books. She'd given before, and sort of that was sort of what the background was with that. And again, it was an open donation. And for me, I haven't met her in person. I mean, we had a couple of Zooms, but she knows that my kids were born. I've sent her pictures of the kids. And again, people that I spoke to working on the book were saying how important it is for children to kind of, have that opportunity to know, if the just to kind of know what their genetic background is. And I know that it's a controversial subject because some people don't agree with open donation and whatever, and that's fine. Everybody's got their own ways of looking at it, but for me personally, I wanted to do something that was open just because I wanted to ask some questions and just kind of let my kids know, here's what I know about this person. So but there's a lot. I have a whole chapter in the book about egg donation.
We definitely do prefer a known donation.
And it's something that's definitely gained traction here in Canada the last even 7, 8 years. It's something that, of course, we help and support people, but especially with the Canadian kind of viewpoint and where we come from on this, and honestly, a lot of the people we help, that is their preference, and that has shifted. And I do think it's important because just like being open and honest about your child being born via surrogacy, it doesn't it's setting your child up for hurt and questions if you have this big secret. There's a lot of talk around that they find out that they are not genetically connected, and then there's this late teenager identity crisis or
Yeah,
whatever,
what else
right?
did you keep from me? Yeah.
And I think on the flip side, as a donor, it's the kinder thing because now you don't have all these young women walking around wondering what happened, or is that child at the mall a product of something I did, or like it takes away the wondering, I think, and leaves
Mhm.
the door open for positive interaction and being able to keep the connection open. Jared and I have our own children, and to be able to connect those dots for them in the future, and like how that looks, and keeping people from being able to accidentally find out they're dating their sibling or something, those kinds of those.
Yeah, and I think, I spoke to a couple of egg donors, one of whom said to me, that one of the things that she regrets, she'd done some anonymous donations, and then she did open donations, and she's like, I would hate to think that like if one of those children one day found me and said to me, I was raised in this terrible home, like, why did you do that to me? It's like this feeling of like, you don't know what family or who that person's going to be, you know what I mean? So it's like, it's also, I think some egg donors feel, that mystery, like, oh gosh, like I didn't know what you were, what kind of family you end up being in. I mean, again, I think it's a really interesting conversation. I think there's a lot of, but I do know that there's that donor conceived community, and a lot of them are really angry. And I think, because you have things like, what is it, 23andMe and these other genetic testing, sort of DNA, you can figure out who your family is pretty quickly, right? And I mean, so imagine if you don't tell your child, and then your child one day is like, hey, I mean, it's just, I can't imagine like how that would feel for somebody if they didn't know. And so I think that the more, again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the more open you are on these things, it's just going to prevent a lot of heartache, hopefully for prevent a lot of heartache for your kids down the road.
100%. If you found out at 24 years old that your parents had lied to you your whole life,
It hurts.
it would
Oh,
be,
I can't even imagine what that would be like. And I think that that's why there's such a lot of anger in that community. And I get it. It must be, I can't, I mean, I can only imagine what that must feel like. And so I think the more, again, I think it's good that, there are conversations around talking about this more and being open on these things.
have your children like ever had an interaction with your egg donor?
No, not yet. I mean, it's funny because turns out that our egg donor she grew up in another part on another side of Lake Michigan. She's also somebody who grew up sort of in the Great Lakes states. We talk a little bit about her, but we haven't met her yet. And I think at this point, if those conversations happen down the road and they want to, I've left that line of communication open. And I've sent her pictures. She's seen pictures of the kids. And right now, that's a really
Well,
that's
the
a
door's
great place to
open.
be.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think the
yeah,
important is the door is open. Kind of
yeah.
changing gears. Now that your book is done, what Are you done leaving your mark on the fertility world? Do you feel like there's more for you to explore?
Do you have another book coming?
Is it
Oh
something?
no, I'm not done. I'm not done. This book made me an advocate. The first line in the book is that, this book helped change the law. I mean, Michigan Fertility Alliance is still going strong. We're working on issues around insurance mandates for IVF. We just started a new national coalition that we're working with other grassroots advocacy organizations across the US, working on not only things like insurance mandates for IVF and surrogacy laws, but also trying to put down really bad laws that are coming up. I don't want to get too political here, but the administration in the US right now is really scary. And there's lots of really bad bills that are coming. You're seeing, not only fetal personhood bills coming up, but you're also seeing like weird, you know, fetuses mentioned in bills that aren't at all related to, whatever. Like there was a water bill in California where like the last page of the bill mentioned fetuses, and it's like, whoa, that's not even real. So they're trying to sneak all these things in. So our work is not done. Like I said, we started this national coalition in January, and we're fighting because we realize we've got a big battle ahead. I think a lot of grassroots organizations, we're the ones that are on the front lines in different states working on these things. So no, I probably spend more time these days working on my sort of fertility healthcare stuff than I do as a journalist. And my kids are always like, "Are you doing another Zoom about this fertility stuff?" So I'm still very much involved. It's a passion of mine, and I may write another book, not about this. I've actually been thinking about writing a book about maple syrup, but that's another story. But yeah, I mean, I think for now, but yeah, definitely I'm still very much involved in all of this as a conversation. And yeah, it's really important. Again, we've got this Trump executive order that came out, in February. So we're all really concerned about what that's going to look like too. So we've got a long battle ahead. We are not done.
Is this something that you're going to also venture into the UK laws around surrogacy?
Well, I don't know about that in a way, maybe. I mean, the UK has been looking at changing their surrogacy laws. There was a white paper that came out, I think, 2 years ago, because, again, the laws here are really antiquated. There's something called mata semper certa est, which means the mother is always certain. And what that is it's a Roman law principle, meaning that whoever gives birth to the child is considered to be the mother, which, as we know with IVF and gestational surrogacy, isn't the case. But for example, in the UK, when we brought our kids back here, in order for me to get them British birth certificates, we had to adopt them from our surrogate. And so and that's a real issue. There have been cases here in the UK where surrogates didn't want to sign these things called parental orders. And there's one case where the surrogate got angry with the intended parents, and the kids are now teenagers. And every time they need to apply for a new passport, take their children abroad, whatever, they have to go to the surrogate, and get permission. So there's definitely room for a lot of change here in the UK. I don't know if I'll necessarily get on the bandwagon here as much, just because I don't know the laws as well. But yeah, I'm definitely keeping my eye on things here, and who knows? Who knows? Might just become advocate in the UK as well.
What brought your ties to the book? Because you talk about the ties in the US, you talk a little bit about the ties in the UK, and then it was Israeli, right? That you had brought.
Well, just Israeli, because Israel has a really interesting system of surrogacy, in terms of how they do surrogacy. And so there's just a really great researcher who has done lots of research looking at surrogacy. So I just mentioned Israel because there's just been a lot of research, and sort of while I was working on the book, the law changed in Israel. It used to be that gay men could not do surrogacy, and that law is now changed as well. So the thing that's very interesting to me is that you see, some laws changing in some countries, like the terrible law that came out last year in Italy about cross-border surrogacy. But then you have places like Thailand that are thinking about sort of changing they shut down international surrogacy. They're thinking about opening that back up again. Denmark also is sort of liberalizing their surrogacy laws. So for every country that sort of slams the door on cross-border surrogacy, there are other countries that are sort of liberalizing their laws. So it's a real mixed bag across the globe. So I think it's a conversation that we'll be having for a long time coming.
Yes, definitely. Definitely.
Do you have any questions for us as Canadian girls in the trenches on this?
Well, I do have a question. I was speaking to a senator from Ontario a couple of years ago. I interviewed her for the book, and she was talking to me about, putting forth maybe some changes in Canada on surrogacy. And so and I know that sort of there are also some changes in terms of expenses, because I think for a while, as I understand it, it used to be that, there was sort of you could sort of, charge, expenses of your entire sort of mobile phone bill, for example, but now you can only, you know, get compensation for the actual phone calls that were sort of going in relation to, your surrogacy or whatever. So, I mean, I'm just curious to see sort of, where is that going in Canada? Are they talking about, changing the law? It's a real, I'm just wondering what's happening in terms
Health
of that.
Canada did bring in like crackdown. So it was Health Canada that brought that in. And it isn't as bad as like line by line, phone by phone call,
Just a
but it's
percentage.
percentages now. Like
Okay.
we're gonna look at your life, we're gonna look at what you're doing and what basically what percentage we're gonna, deem towards surrogacy for your phone bill, for instance. Like it
Like
is that.
if there's 5 people living in your house, they're not going to reimburse your entire grocery bill, but they will reimburse the percentage of what you are consuming.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Like it's
Hmm.
very, that is, and there's been some shifts and there has been some things. And the lawyers that we work with, we talk to them, quite routinely about this because the lawyers we do work with, some of them are the ones that have helped write the legislation, have helped, have been a part of those talks. And I think in a lot of ways, sadly, it's something that's not, top of the list. Like,
Right.
not, this isn't something that's, yeah, at the top of everyone's list. So I don't know and even the lawyers really seem to like, we kind of just keep doing what we're doing in a lot of ways. It was a bigger deal when those Health Canada regulations came in and they wanted to like, there was a bit of a crackdown there and some changes and
Mhm.
those kinds of things. But it doesn't feel like anything is going to blow open anytime soon. Um,
Mhm.
I think in a lot of ways we'll stay kind of same old same. One of the points I actually wanted to loop back around when you talked about meeting with your surrogate, Lorraine, who is our owner and founder, she actually just went to her surrogate baby's high school graduation in
Wow.
in the fall. And kind of when you were talking about some like kind of conversations and just like reflection, she actually came on the podcast and talked about it. Um, she had kind of that conversation with her surrogate and more of an in-depth like, but it took until the high school graduation for them to like kind of roundtable some of those things and going through the journey and the way things felt and some of those things. So it took her, it took them,
18 years.
18 years, but it was really, really powerful
Mhm.
listening to that between that, intended mom and the surrogate in the story. And it was really,
Once be able to like sit back and see it, the whole picture.
yeah, the
Mhm.
complete, we've got this tiny human to adulthood and
Yeah.
talking that through, which was really cool. So I people really love that and people like the full circleness. And so I think that's really cool that you got to meet with your surrogate because it's very special to us and our team and the ones that we're close to that when that full circle
Mhm.
moment happens, I think it's really important and
Yeah.
cool.
And I think she thought it was really special too. And it was really sweet because her daughter was, with her. And, I remember meeting her daughter when she was like 12, right? And now she's, in university and, she was really good with the kids. And it was just really neat I mean, it's a funny relationship with a surrogate because they're not family, they're not friend. There's like this deeper connection. And it's like you can't really define what that is. And it's sort of and it's funny, I was explaining this talking to my friend Stephanie, who founded Michigan Fertility Alliance. I gave her a call on Monday and we were talking about, seeing Julie on Saturday. And she was really like the only person that got it. You know what I mean? Like, my friends and my mom and everybody else were like, "Oh, that's really cool. You got to see her." But like Stephanie was the only one that was like, "Yep, I know exactly like what you're, and it's just I think when you meet other people who've gone through this, there's a bond that you have with them too, right? Because it's like you just sort of have that. And I one of my friends at school makes fun of me because, if I find out that there's a couple of families at school who have had their kids through surrogacy, a couple of them are gay dads, a couple of them are just people like me, and I'm always like, I'll be like, oh, like, did you have your kids through surrogacy? And then I just kind of like pounce on them because I'm like really excited to talk to them about it. So there's this a connection there that you have with people who've gone through it.
Know that someone else has been in the same trench as you is really, really special.
When it's
Yeah.
just comforting, like it helps
Yeah.
in the not feeling so alone.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
as much as it's, such a
Not
big
what you
space,
pictured.
no, but it can be really isolating too.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
Feel
Yeah.
like all of my friends had a baby the regular way, and now I'm on this journey by myself.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's nice to know there are other people out there that have gone through the same thing and like you said, gone through the trenches and you can really bond with them on that. And there's a special relationship that you kind of have with those people, even though you may not be that connected to them and other things, there's that sort of surrogacy connection. That's yeah.
So bouncing all over the place. Do you work full time at your like as a journalist still and you're doing all this in your spare time?
Well, funny enough, so I'm freelance, so I still work as a journalist, but as I said, this passion of mine is sort of on fertility healthcare. So I've been doing more and more and more work in terms of in that space versus sort of my journalism. I still do it. I'm still, definitely. I don't think I'll ever stop being a journalist, but it's not as much of a passion of mine as it has been in the past because I sort of found this new sort of passion, which is this advocacy and grassroots work.
This
I
has been a
love
great
these.
conversation.
I love these conversations. I love when I get to like turn this part of my brain on and talk about these kinds of things. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you both so much. It was really a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you and to also learn a bit more about sort of surrogacy in Canada. And I'm glad that we were connected because I'm sure down the road I might be like, I know these two women. I have a question about, surrogacy in Canada. I know who I can reach out to. So
Absolutely.
Yes. And I'm very, very excited to read your book.
Yeah,
So.
and I will be I will order my own copy. I was gonna say I steal books from Tara, but I'll order my own copy of your book.
well, thank you very much. It's very exciting. It's been on the bestseller list in certain categories on Amazon, like the reproductive health care and fertility and stuff. So people are buying it. So I'm really really grateful. And so yeah, hopefully it'll be an interesting read and people will learn stuff and yeah, hopefully laugh at a couple things too maybe. So
Love that. Well, thank you so much for
We'll let
taking
you-
the
we'll let
time
you
and yeah,
get to
let you
your-
deal with your
We'll let you get to your trouble.
yeah.
super. Listen, thanks so much. It was lovely to chat. All right, take care.